It's an amazing honor to be here. I've had a long-standing collaboration with Linda. It's wonderful to be here in this very special place where, as you said, Nelson Mandela really did care about children. So it's wonderful to see that you've built such a fantastic hospital of the likes that I've not seen anywhere, really. So what is it that we're really interested in today? On a day like this, when I had sort of hoped to come to summer, and instead I seem to have brought the weather with me. So the rains, I think of no better thing than to go on YouTube and search for 4 laughing babies. And if you do that, you get something like this.
They're going to make me laugh, actually.
Aren't they cute? And it's just contagious. I mean, it's difficult not to. 4 of them, right? Imagine what it's like when they're crying. I mean, you never get tired of it, and it's perfect for the kind of weather you normally get in England. Although I understand it's usually better here. So, what is it about life? What is it about life, you know, growing up in a sink like this, babysitting in a half-full tub and still feeling that the world is a wonderful place? What is it about growing up with the right kind of parents? What is it about growing up with no parents in orphanages, like in this image from Sebastian Salgado from Latin America? What is it like? Orphanages, of course, should be banned. There's no good idea of them. Really what we need is caregiving. And what we tend to forget is that children are vulnerable. They're basically not fully formed. We have to take care of them, and the extended human childhood requires extensive nurturing. And if there are long-term problems, and again, the listeners will have heard about this before, there's an incredible toll being taken by parental postnatal depression. And even if there's something wrong on the part of the baby with a cleft, that changes things and makes it a lot harder to care for that and give it the right kind of caregiving. So what I'm going to take you today through is basically talk to you about the kind of research we've done. But I also have to show you this image of the kinds of problems that are in low and middle income countries around the world. You can see that places like Malawi, there are mothers there, 30% of mothers in some townships. Same, of course, in parts of South Africa. So we really need to use the neuroscience to basically make a difference in the world. And that's why I've come all this way to talk about the neuroscience, so that together we can find potential solutions to that. And as this particular graph shows, it's important to invest in the early years. Hickman, who got the Nobel Prize in economics, showed that if you start very early, you get much more bang for your bucks. Solve the problems early, and you don't have to spend a lot of money later on. So we need to look inside the brain. In this image, you can see a mother cradling her daughter. This is actually quite a well-known researcher from MIT with her daughter in the scanner, Rebecca Sachs. And at the same time, we're also important that we don't use these scanners in a sort of neophrenological way. Here's a study where I'm showing you where they put people in a scanner where they either looked at an image of their baby or of their romantic love, and they looked at what kind of activity was there. And it's just blobology. It's nothing to do with love. It's just blobs. How can we go beyond those kind of blobs? How can we actually get to mechanisms in the brain? And this is where I probably have to get a little bit personal here. So on your left, you can see my grandfather. And he was a pediatrician of some note in Denmark, where I'm from. And he was my great hero. You can see me, quite young at this point, basically playing with my grandfather in the garden. I always wanted to be like my grandfather. I knew that I wanted to work on the brain. I knew I wanted to work with children. At the same time, as I grew older, I became aware that my grandfather had this problem of too much empathy. Is there such a thing as too much empathy? He certainly found it very difficult to leave those kids in the hospital. It was very difficult for him to make that leap. And so I thought, what could I do? If I didn't want to become a doctor, what could I do? Neuroscience hadn't really started when I came of the age where I could start studying in university. So I had this crazy idea that maybe, just maybe, I should become a computer scientist. Maybe I could convince the people that were designing the course at the University of Copenhagen that I could really reverse engineer the brain, and that I could basically try to see whether I could take courses from around the university to understand this. And they graciously allowed me to do this, and I realized that emotion really is at the heart of who we are. And understanding the brain is really about understanding how emotions are guiding our every kind of decisions. At the same time, though, because I am large, I contain multitudes, I couldn't help myself but also do a degree at the Royal Academy of Fine Arts. And you'll see later that that was the kind of thing where I couldn't help myself make sculptures, because I think there's no real difference between science and art. It's all the same endeavor, and it's all about really getting to know who we are as humans. And so eventually, when I then wanted to study the brain and use those new scanners that had come online, I moved to Oxford, as this particular image will show you, and I wrote a thesis called The Functional Neuroanatomy of Emotions. And that was a very interesting time. And I learned a lot about the brain, some of which I'm now going to tell you about. Because as we're looking at each other, the only part of the brain that we can actually see with the naked eye is exactly the eye, is the iris. Here's a photo of a young lady's eye. This is my good friend Annie Cattrall, who is a sculptress. This is her niece. This is her eye, and this is her mother's eye. And as you look into it, what is it that you see? Because you see, one of the things that's important about us humans, and in fact any of the kind of species on this earth, is that we have templates. We have things that we kind of try to see. So what I'm showing you here is an image, black and white image of something that I don't think anybody really can see what it is. And yet all I need to do is to show you the full photograph of the actual two little girls, my two daughters when they were younger, sitting there, and then you can't help yourself, now that you've got the template, to see them there. So we're prediction machines. We're very good at finding templates and trying to predict from those templates what is going to happen. What about when we hear things, though? Here's an image of a young girl who's got a cochlear implant, and what happens with cochlear implants is that they give us hearing back, or this particular child. But of course, it's a much reduced version of hearing. You take any kind of sound like I'm making now, and then you downsample it. And then I'll now play you what it is that she's hearing. That is very difficult to make any head or tails of, right? And yet, if I play you what is actually being said,
the wife of your husband,
and you now hear it again, you can now hear, because now you've built a template. Now you are able to predict what it is that's going to happen next. And so that's really who we are. We are prediction machines. And John Steinbeck, a great writer, wrote a wonderful book called The Log from the Sea of Cortez, together with a field biologist. Again, not really making this distinction between art and science. Ed Ricketts was the marine biologist's name, and they wrote this fantastic passage which says, man might be described fairly adequately, if simply, as a two-legged paradox. He has never become accustomed to the tragic miracle of consciousness. Perhaps, as been suggested, his species is not set, has not gelled, but is still in a state of becoming, bound by his physical memories to a past of struggle and survival, limited in his futures by the uneasiness of thought and consciousness. Tragic miracle of consciousness. That's what we're all living. But at least we could have some fun while we're doing it, right? This is an image of a scanner. There's a beautiful one just downstairs from here. It's the kind of scanner that some of you will already have been in, because of course anything happens and you want to peer inside the part of the body, this is what you use. And when you do that, you can get images of brains. Here are just 15 different brains, cross-sections through the middle of the brain, and yet I challenge any of you, even some of my colleagues, to tell me which of these, of the 8 of them are men and which of the 7 are women. It's almost impossible to tell. There are no gross differences in how the brain looks. On average, we can say that the female brain is slightly smaller because the female body is slightly smaller, but that's all that we can really say. But of course, the real issue is what is it that's going on when we're using it. Here's a spinning brain, and when people look at that in Oxford, they say, "Oh, yes, Morton, I see you're Danish. It's like Hamlet. Alas, poor Yorick, I knew him so well." And that skull, of course, does look a bit like Hamlet, but that's not what I want you to look at. I want you to look at the blobs. Because the red blob, which is in the back of the brain, is where vision comes in. And the blue is where hearing comes in. So you see how the dark blue. And the light blue is where you've got somatosensory, so that is your sense of touch. And then orange and yellow is where smell and taste comes in. And that's a beautiful map, but it's exactly probology. You know, it tells you that when you see things, you might get activity here. But like with any map, and this is why I put here P dragons, the most interesting part is all the white spots on the map. Because of course that's where things come together. And yet, when I showed this to my friend Danny Catchwell, she couldn't help says, Morton, we got to make a sculpture. And so we did. We took each of these 3D images of the different senses, and we built this set of sculptures called the senses, which you can, if you go to London, you can go to the Walcott Museum and see this. And basically this is sort of like a neural portrait of what it's like to experience the world. And here's another sort of close-up of it. And there's something, I think, quite poetic about that. But of course, the science here is very much there, the art, because I'm really just a midwife in this. So one of the things I learned from doing the emotional mappings is that emotions are like very sort of strange molecules, very complex, but they consist of atoms. And those are the pleasures of the pain. And that's really where we're going now. So just indulge me for a moment. Think about dessert. I don't know how many of you have dessert out there. I certainly could use dessert, maybe some coffee. So I'm thinking about and I'm wanting to engage with coffee or dessert. Particularly chocolate, I think that would be good. And as I do that, once I start eating it, I get into a phase where I actually like things. And it's a very different kind of dance than from when I'm wanting things. And then eventually, once I've had the chocolate, we can go back to talking about science. So all of our experiences go into that. And pleasure, I would argue, is really what enables the state transition, enables us to make those decisions that makes us quite efficient beings. And so I've done a lot of studies, a lot of robology. I've put people in scanners when they had food, when they're doing social things, even when they were doing methamphetamines. This was before crystal meth. So I injected drug-naive Oxford undergraduate with drugs just to see how pleasurable it was. They didn't get addicted. When you look at what happens in their brains, you see that it's very much a sort of a circumscribed network of regions that have to talk to each other. I was even able to get ethics to do gambling. The one thing I really wanted to do, and as my bio said, was sex. But in England, we are supposed to close our eyes and think of England, right? And it was much harder to get ethics, in fact, impossible compared to getting it for crystal meth. Go figure. I couldn't even do it in Denmark, where we're supposed to be liberal and open-minded. But then, of course, this is when you call your Dutch friend. So a very good friend of mine, Janneke Goyardis, did this. And we were very interested in this part of the brain called the orbital frontal cortex, because that's where all the pleasure is happening. Just over your eyeballs is one of the most important parts of what makes an emotional brain. Anyway, when he then did this study, he was very interested in that elusive thing of female orgasms. And what I'm showing you here is the image that is comparing when women fake orgasms with having orgasms. And you can see there's a big difference. Nothing much is happening when they are imitating or faking it. And of course, a lot of things happen when they have the orgasm. And you can think that's quite frivolous to talk about sex on a... At the same time, of course, this is where we're all going now. You have to have sex in order to have babies, so you might as well be pleasurable. But the key thing here is, as you can see in this particular graph, is that the brain changes. There are different kinds of regions being involved when you desire things, when you're aroused, compared to when you're actually liking something, in this case sex, or very different when you have the orgasms, to when you can then think about cricket again. So there's something really important here, and of course the key thing here is that sometimes when you get addicted to things, you end up spending all of your time in the wanting phase. You find it very difficult, and you no longer like the things that you didn't like before. And so understanding this, and understanding how it is that you basically go through this very sort of elaborate choreography, is really about understanding how we can then try to help with anhedonia, the lack of pleasure, which is found in affective disorders. And we can now start to think about what kind of drugs are being involved, as I say here, the dopamines, the opioids that make this particular thing happen. And we can even start to think about what regions are involved. Here's the brain of a rat, and you can do things to rat that you can't do to human beings, but you can see there's a whole network of regions that have to talk to each other in certain ways for us to be able to like things. And yet, of course, what I've shown you so far is just phrenology. I'm a little bit like that guy from the 17th century Punch, with all these different dots on different parts of the head that makes me like different things. So how did we go beyond that? Well, so once I had the chance, I founded this research group in 2006 called Hedonia, where we put people in scanners, so we get this kind of imaging. Also, the kind of hairdryer is called an MEG scanner that allows us to look at what happens over milliseconds, so thousands of a second. We can even, as I'll show you, stick electrode into people's heads to help them with very debilitating disorders like Parkinson's or whole brain. But it all really don't matter unless you build models of it. Just like with Galileo, You have to ask the right question, you have to get the right kind of data, and then you have to build a model. And then, of course, you can treat that model just like an animal model. And in order to that, you have to have a friend, not this time in Holland, but in Barcelona. This is my friend Gustavo Deco, drinking coffee with him and building these models, doing this kind of things where we look at the wiring in the brain and look at how signals spread. And so think about how things spread. Think about what happens if you took a glass plate and you then put some sand on it and you put different tones on that glass plate. Have a look at this one. And now, before I do that, just have a look at this quote. Quid recipitur ad modum recipientis recipitur. I don't know how good your Latin is, but basically it means that the content is shaped by the container. And in this case, if you think about the glass plate and the sand corns, have a look at this little video. You can see how different tones make different kind of patterns. And it's solely linked to the kind of vibrations that are on this particular plate. Now, this is an organizing principle in nature, that different harmonics will give rise to different kinds of movements. And it's true of many different things, like for instance here for sound as well. In fact, this is the sand with different kinds of vibrations. You see how it gives us very beautiful, different kind of patterns. If you change the container, you get very different kinds of patterns as well. Here's a guitar, and you see how it is that those harmonics spread in very different ways that then gives us these beautiful things called music. You can even start to basically look at the diffusion equations. You can start to think about how you get these harmonic patterns in space and time. And if you change the frequencies and the way they propagate through, say, acoustics, like I show you here, or quantum mechanics, like I show you here, or electromagnetism, you can see how we give rise to different kinds of patterns. And even if you think about something which, of course, is dear to your heart here in South Africa in the mid games, giraffes, jaguars, zebras, if you look at how it is with different parameters, you spread these kind of things, you get the different kinds of patterns. This is exactly how the leopard's got its patterns. And the big question, of course, is what happens then if you spread that within the brain, within the structure. And here I'm showing you the wiring of a brain, the human connectome. And so think about if you then spread different kinds of harmonics through this. This is the work of my good friends in an Atasoy, who's together with us have shown that you basically get these sort of multiple components, which is what is making up your brain activity. You can then start to build models of this. You can see how things propagate. And once you do that, and don't be frightened by the math here, you can basically build models that will replicate the kinds of activities you see. So that means suddenly I'm no longer constrained by the phenology. Suddenly you have a model that I can lesion and find out what parts of your brain are important for things like parental love. And you can see that there are various different things like incoherence and cluster synchrony. Turns out the best brains are those that are metastable, that are perched. And I'm sure you've heard about tipping points, perched just at the bifurcation, so that it has the maximal ability to move around. And so, just before we get into the parental brains, let's just have a brief look at my friend Thibaut Assis, who's talking about his work, as you can see here, with a potential future patient. And he's talking about his wonderful work on deep brain. It's a good thing that the listeners can't hear who we're looking at. Right? The deep brain stimulation experiments, where basically we, through his work, in monkeys in this case, has worked out that if somebody's got Parkinson's and you stimulate, you implant an electrode, you drill a hole into a certain part of the brain, you can basically help with the symptoms by putting in a very brief pulse of about 130 hertz into what is known as the STM. Let me just show you a brief video of one of our patients.
The probe that is placed into the brain, I understand, comes level with the top of the nose and the ear. And it is connected to a battery in my chest, underneath the skin in my chest here. And this is controlled. I can control the amount of the voltage going in. I can control the length of time that the pulses. And I can identify the number of times per second as it goes in. And I'll turn myself off now.
Yeah, that was really turning himself off. So notice how when he turns himself off, that he immediately starts shaking, because now he's no longer being, and you see he's only got it on one side, so the tremor is only on his right side because he's got hemiparkinsonian tremors. And it's very difficult. He's now trying very hard to control this tremor. And the key thing is, in a moment, he's going to try to turn himself back on. And you'll see how difficult it is for him to operate in any sensible way. Now, he's now going to turn himself back on, and you'll see this in a moment, and it looks a bit cruel. But it's very important that as a patient, he has full control over the treatments. And let's just have a look. Notice how that demon that seemed to have possessed his body is suddenly gone. Notice how it's almost like a medical miracle, really. So how does that work? And what about if you did it to children? Here's a young girl who's got dystonia DIT1, which is a terrible disease because cognitively she's completely there, but she's finding it difficult. She's sitting in this wheelchair, putting her hands out and just holding them steady. Almost impossible for her to stand up. Now, if you implant, in this case, an electrode in the internal segment of the globus pallidus, again at 130 hertz, and you operate and you put a pacemaker under her skin, and you then, of course, because a lot of her muscles are no longer functioning well, so you do a lot of physiotherapy. After 18 months, this is a girl who's got her life back. I mean, look at her. Isn't she wonderful? If you met her today, she's now, it's been about 15 years since we operated on her. She's somebody, notice how her left arm at this point wasn't particularly perfect. But of course the sad thing is that if we turn that off, then we don't no longer have the crutches. But the cool thing about this is, unlike Parkinson's, where it's only helping with the symptoms in a neurodegenerative disorder, here's somebody who can really get their life back. I was talking earlier, as I took a tour of this wonderful place, about the potential for doing this here in South Africa. Lots of kids suffer from these, and I think we could really offer them very full lives. And then, of course, you can look at why is it that things are changing. And here I'm just showing you the parts of the brain in red that change as you stick the electrode in. And it's only because we've now got these whole brain computational models. This was 15 years of my life right here, trying to do this. So I was very excited about that. But you can also do it for things like chronic pain. So you can stimulate there for 20 hertz, the chronic pain in the phantom limb that is no longer there will go away. Now if you stimulate 100 hertz, the pain becomes unbearable, suggesting that pain and pleasure are different. In fact, of course, different sides to the same coin. And so Annie said, why don't we make a sculpture of that? So this is a sculpture of pain and pleasure, and the connections of where we stick the electrode. But what about those pesky babies? Here's a lot of them running around as they do. What is it that makes them so cute, and what is it in our brains that changes us in such a way? The first thing to realize is that as a parent we have certain possibilities, certain things that we have to look at. Immediately when they're very small, they have no other thing than basically cuteness. They become the main focus of our attention. And they really have to give us the tools to give us the right kind of responsiveness. After that, as they get a bit older and a little bit less cute, we have to provide them with emotional scaffolding, principally through warmth, consistent support, especially in stressful situations, which helps a child maintain emotional regulation. And then as they get even older, we then start to have to give them the capacity to provide sensitive responsiveness in relation to the child's attachment and relevant need. And that, of course, is mostly about separations. So today I'm going to talk mostly about the first part. So what is it about babies that attracts us? The way they look, the way they sound, the way they smell. This is all work that I've done with Alan Stein, who I'll talk about a bit later. He's a native of this country and has worked a long time in Oxford, but also has done a lot of work in this country together with Linda and others. So what is it about those babies? Here's Konrad Lorenz in the water with the geese that earned him his Nobel Prize. He showed that if you show yourself to geese within a few hours before birth, they think that you're their mother. So that's why they're following around into the water. He also had this idea of what he called a kinship schema. So there's something about the features of mammals and birds that means that we cannot help ourselves but have a template that attaches us to them. And Walt Disney clearly had a read of that paper. So he made from what was quite a nasty rodent, if you look at Mickey Mouse when he was earlier, to something that became more and more childlike. Something with larger eyes, large ears, small body, kind of funny kind of looking feather. So we couldn't help ourselves but take data from some of the trials that we did with mothers and their infants and standardize the faces when they were happy, when they were neutral, when they were sad, and basically try to match them to adult faces. But of course, the key thing about baby faces is they have these strange proportions. You know, these large eyes, this large forehead. Some babies are more attractive than others. When people rate these things, they find that this baby is more cute than that. Maybe it's also the cross-eyedness that makes it slightly more cute. But you can actually make an algorithm that just by measuring these proportions will tell you that objectively this is more cute than that. And you can then ask people, how much do you like that? So you can say, well, this is quite a cute baby. But, you know, that's just us giving ratings of that. What if you wanted to have sort of an implicit rating? What if you just showed an image of a baby and then you had a bar that was slowly decreasing, and you could basically change that by pressing a key very hard. You could make that either stay longer or go away longer. So that bar is slowly decreasing, and you can measure how much time you're willing to work to have that face on the screen. So if you do this to men and women, you find what most people would say, namely that men don't like babies. So men will consistently say that they like baby less than women, both, by the way, both for infant but also for adults. But on the other hand, if you look at how much they're willing to work, something that they can't really measure, you see that they are willing to work as much for infants, for how long they're on the screen, compared to how much a woman would do. And interestingly, it's not as if they're not sensitive to how cute they are. If you take these objective measures of cuteness, you can see that they rate them lower, the ones that are not so cute, compared to the other ones, but they also work less to them. But again, I think this shows that men do like babies. It's just not okay for us to say that we like them. Or as W.C. Fields would say, it's not that I don't like babies, 2 hours in the oven, I'll be just fine. Which of course is not that funny. Now, if you look at babies and you compare them to adults, we thought, what if we could look at what actually happens over milliseconds as we look into the brain? And so the standard story goes that you see something, and remember you have the red in the back of the brain, goes through your iris, gets to the back of the brain, and then activity moves forward in an orderly fashion on the ventral and a dorsal stream, and eventually comes to the frontal part of the brain, and you say, I like some things, I don't like some things. This is what was the status quo when Alan and I did the study with the new hairdryer back in 2004, really, and we published it in 2006. Here's the hairdryer. It has to be like a hairdryer because it has to have liquid helium, because it has to supercool the magnets that are sitting inside that allows us to pick up the signals from the brain. And when we did that, we were very surprised, because we shouldn't have been surprised about this, and we weren't. There's a face area. If you lose this part of the brain, so just over the cerebellum, this is the brain seen from below, and you're basically looking at this area, and it will reliably respond to faces. If you lose it, you can no longer see faces. This is what Oliver Sacks talked about when he wrote the book, The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. He just couldn't see faces. So if there's something wrong with that, and you can see here, after about 130 to 170 milliseconds, you get activity both to the baby and to the adult. But what we were very surprised about was that we immediately at the same time got activity in what I've shown you is the pleasure brain, namely the orbitofrontal cortex, only to the baby and not to the adult, suggesting there's almost like a brain signature of looking at babies. And these were all adults that had not yet had children. So in other words, and they were both men and women, and there were no differences between men and women. In other words, we have a template for babies. It shouldn't really surprise us, given that we would be not particularly well off if we didn't have babies and care for them. But what happens then if you have something that is wrong? What happens if you have a beautiful baby but with a cleft lip? Now, again, perhaps not surprisingly, in people that are not used to seeing those kind of babies, what you find is that this particular signature in the orbitofrontal cortex goes away. You no longer have a significant response in the orbitofrontal cortex. It's almost like the brain looks at that and says, no, it doesn't fit the template. I can't really care for it. And that could be bad news. But the good news is if you look at those who care for them, namely surgeons and nurses and people that have had babies with this, they don't really look at that. They look at that and say, that's a really cute baby. And so we've been scanning the brains of experts, and it looks as if they basically have ways of overriding that. And if they can do it, we can all do it. So we could potentially build interventions that allow parents that know that they will have a cleft child to basically make sure that that's not an important thing that stops them from caregiving. So I think that's pretty exciting. But what about the sounds that they make? We know that things come in through the ear, through the tympanic membrane and so on, and eventually gets to the cortex. But before it goes there, it goes via the brainstem. Here, just what different things look like: an infant cry, an infant laugh, and an adult cry. And you can see they're sort of very different kind of waves, but yet they're also quite simple. So we built a big database that, for those of you who are interested in these things, can just write to me and ask for. But basically, we had about 173 positive, neutral, and negative non-verbal sounds of infant, adults, and domestic animals. Yes, domestic animals, mostly cats, kittens, and puppies. We rated them for valence and so on. And when you do that, you can use them for all kinds of things, including what we call the whack-a-mole experiment. So I've just come on the plane, as you know, 2 days ago, and there was an infant crying on that plane, quite close to me, and I had this urge to help the mother look after the baby, as we all do, which of course is not socially acceptable, especially not for a man. So what is it about those cries? Why is it that we cannot help ourselves but feel that we need to help people or shut them out? And why is it that we can't just, like with babies, close our eyes, close our ears? So we did this experiment called whack-a-mole. You probably tried it in fun parks. Something pops up, a mole, and you immediately have to. In this particular case, it's a very simple version. We don't use hammers, but we basically just use a finger. You have a matrix of 3 by 3 things, and you have to pop the one that basically lights up. Now, we then did that in 3 different ways. We first did the experiment after you've listened to a baby crying for 5 minutes, and then you did the experiment. Then you did 5 minutes of a woman crying, and then you did the experiment, and then you did 5 minutes of bird songs. And to our surprise, and probably shouldn't be a surprise, was that you were both much faster at the game when you heard the baby cry compared to the adult and to the birdsong, but you also applied more force, suggesting that there's something about the vocalization, something about the template of crying that means that we cannot help ourselves but actually do something very quickly. And that has to do with a part of the brain called the PAG, which is where I told you earlier that I was stimulating in order to help with pain. Pain, of course, is another signal that allows us to react very quickly. Now, instead of stimulating, if you record, and as we did in 4 patients that had this operation, we could see that within 50 milliseconds, your brain is responding to those signals, which is very exciting, I think, because it tells us something about how hardwired it is, those vocalizations. And notice that it's different, say, from crying from a woman. And then we used the hairdryer again, and we found, just like with the visual stimuli, that we got activity at the same time as you heard the sound and were able to identify the sound. We got activity in the pleasure centers of the brain, and specifically the orbitofrontal cortex. So that's all well and good, but what about when we become parents? So at the moment I'm running this large study in Denmark, where we basically scan people before they have children, before they are wanting to make children. We help them. We have a very industrial no. They have children eventually, and we scan them again, and then we scan them later on to see how it is that brains change. Now, surprisingly, given that everyone in this room and all the listeners out there will all have had parents or have parents, it's surprising that we know so little about what actually goes on longitudinally. One of the things I'm hoping with Linda is that we can do exactly this in her wonderful Birth to 20 cohort, so that Denmark and South Africa could be leading the way here. I'm hoping that we can use the scanner here to actually look at what it is that changes in South African brains as well. My best guess is that they're going to be exactly like those in Denmark. But what is it then if you just looked at them after they had babies? Not before, but just after, just to do a cross-sectional study, and we did that. So this is just the activity in the whole brain when you are crying, and when mothers listen to babies crying, not their own, but just something, compared to non-mothers. And you find a whole network of regions that are involved. But importantly, it turns out that the expertise that you have, how much time you've had with the infant, and the activity in parts like the amygdala and elsewhere will change as a function of how much experience you've had. And that kind of makes sense. And that, of course, is why we're scanning both men and women, because it turns out, as I showed you earlier, there are no big differences, but of course, once you have expertise in something, like having a baby, that will change your brain. I mean, anecdotally speaking, before I had my first daughter, when young women were, walking past with their prams, I usually looked at the woman. And as you can probably guess, afterwards, I'm now just looking at the baby, so something's gone wrong, right? And of course, as a man, I'm not supposed to actually admit to that. But, so what can be done about it then? So this is Alan Stein in a study that was done in Kajdica. As you all know, it's a shanty town near Cape Town where the rates of poverty and disease and postnatal depressions are pretty depressing. So what can you do? Well, Alan is a remarkable man, but his father was an even more remarkable man, and I like just to take a few moments to pay homage to Harry Stein, who for many, many years basically made the trip to Barra, where he basically helped a lot of black kids be born and basically looked after them. So I think he was really the reason why Alan went into medicine, and the reason why Alan then became very, almost obsessed, I would say, with trying to help with mental health. Because of course, once we've sorted out the physical problems, which is what Harry spent most of his time, Alan realized that really what we need to do is to take care of the mental health. And so we're all sort of shaped by the families we have. And Alan then thought, why not do a randomized control trial, looking at women and trying to help them then develop some tools in the kind of situation they're in. And it's not to say that somebody came in and actually then solved everything for them. All they did was that they tried to provide ways of thinking about the baby. So we know from Alan's work that if you have a depressed mother and you have a camera on the baby and a camera on the mother, and you basically, you take this footage around a feeding situation, say. And so what you do is you will see the mother being quite avoidant, they're not looking in the eyes, the baby knows that there's going to be not a lot of great deal of contact, so it's quite a stressful situation. Now, because you've got a camera though, on both of them, you can film everything that happens. And after which you can sit with the mother and think about, go through the whole kind of experience blow by blow. And it might just be that because the baby is hungry, just before he's being fed, he will smile. And you can then show that photo to the mother and you say, your baby just smiled, and the mother will go, no, my baby never smiles, because they're deep in their ruminations, which is one of those terrible things about depression, the social isolation and so on. Now, once you've shown them that image and they look at it and go, that's not my baby, and then they realize it is their baby, and you open that door, you open that template, you suddenly give yourself the chance of actually opening up what is already inside of you. So that's all that they really did in this trial, not by video camera, but by just trying to enable that communication which is in all of us. And not surprisingly, here's some images from the trial with local mothers helping, trying to sort of, either in one group they just gave them physical health, but the other ones they gave them just tips about how to play with your baby. Not again, in a didactic way, but just as a way of opening up what is possible for all of us. What you find is that the babies become much more secure, and the mother's depression also not completely lifted, because as you can see, and this is really quite awful, 28% of the mothers were depressed, and now after 12th month, 18%. So that's a significant decrease, but it's not as much as we really need. So I think a lot more could be done and should be done, and I think the kind of neuroscience that I've sort of shown you now could help with that. And so it sort of leads me to this difficult word, eudaimonia, flourishing. This is what Aristotle talked about. He talked about pleasure being, or happiness being, partly made up of hedonia, which is the name of my group, which is also the experience of pleasure, comes from hetus, which is the sweet taste of honey. But eudaimonia is the sense of flourishing, a life well lived, embedded in meaningful value. And so one of the things I got really excited about was the possibility of using music for this. And in the last 10 minutes or so, I'll just share some insights about how that potentially could be used. Because of course, music is exactly what you would want. It's something that is a bit like chocolate cake, and that's very pleasurable, but it's also a hell of a lot more meaningful than chocolate cake. Here's just some images to remind us that it's perfect for actually interacting between mothers and fathers and their infants, to singing together in group, even karaoke, which is great fun as well, or dancing, as it were. Because what you have to remember is that the kind of situation where we all put on our headphones and we're just listening to music and in our own little headspace is not how music is traditionally done. Traditional music is something we make together in a circle, in a way that is natural and brings out the sociality. Here's a photo of my wife and our oldest daughter dancing, which is what the rest of the women in my family likes to do. I like it too, so I couldn't help myself but actually study this. This is not Barack Obama, as some of my students in Oxford think. It's obviously James Brown, a great singer. And there's a quote there from Steven Pinker saying, music could vanish from our species and the rest of our lifestyle would be virtually unchanged. Now, I have a great respect for Steven Pinker, and I'm sure there are reasons why he would say something like that in an otherwise wonderful book called The Language Instinct, but I think he's completely wrong. I think music could not vanish. I think it really shows us how special we are. And of course, it tells us something about love. It tells us something about the way that we bond together. So how does music work? Well, it's about those templates again, isn't it? There's a meter, and then there's syncopation on top of that, and there are what we call prediction errors. The syncopation that comes just outside the beat is something that we try to basically link to. And here's an example of the man just doing his thing. Get down with the it's kind of hard not to move, right? I played this in Germany and they all go, "Nein, it's not funny." This is so funky, right? Listen to the guitars. It's pretty cool, right? And then he's scatting on top of it. So, yeah, kind of cool. But why is it so funky? Why is it so groovy? Why is it that you're wiggling your ears here and the listeners out there probably are sort of doing their thing as well? It's a bit like this figure bars. You can either see two faces looking at each other or you can see the bars, but you can't see both. It's a bistable phenomenon. And this is what music is. It's between the meter and the syncopations. And so we couldn't help ourselves but take all our favorite funk drum beats and turn them, midify them. So I'm going to play you something that is very predictable and see how you feel about that. It's kind of handbag music, isn't it? It's okay. It's not that exciting. But you could dance to it, right? I mean, you could dance to it. But what about if I just, made it a little bit more unpredictable, a little bit more groovy? So this could sound like this. This is when my oldest daughter look at me and says, "Morton, that's Dad dancing." Anyway, hard not to move, right? Unless you're German, of course. So what if I make it a little bit more unpredictable? A little is not so good. More is a lot better than a lot. Must be like chocolate cake, right? A lot of chocolate must be pretty damn good. So let's just hear what that sounds like. It's too unpredictable, right? It's like, you don't feel the need to fill in. You can't fill in because it's too unpredictable. So how does it work then? Could one develop a mathematics of groove? If you were really geeky, you could do that, and I'll show you in a moment how you could do that. But let's just look at what happens when people rate this for how much they want it to move. Medium one was the best one. I'm sure most of you will agree with that, unless you like 12-tone music, in which case you're probably over here. Again, it's about your template. It's about whether you like the man or not, or the music. What about liking? Again, you get this U-shape function. So what happens when you're on the top of that U-shape? When you're really feeling groovy, you feel you could go this way, you could do that way, you could do a little bit of this way. What is happening in your brain? Before we get there, though, let's just have a look at the mathematics of groove. So basically, you take syncopation as the amount of stimulus deviation from the meter, which increases as you increase the syncopation. There's a formula for you right there. Then you take the meter experience, pi here, as the precision of the prediction. You multiply those two together and you get what we call the explainable prediction error, which is really music appreciation. So it's a very simple formula that has all to do with music appreciation. And you can then look at different genres. You can look at classical music, which I love. Now, there's no rhythm in classical music. It's the devil's music, right? You want to make you who? You can't do that. But what you do instead in order to increase the prediction and the prediction errors is you change the tempo stability. You go up and down. Any of you who have played will know this. What about jazz? There you play a lot with the rhythm and the meter. And the tempo stability is sort of more or less stable. But what about groove? There you keep a completely stable tempo, 120 beats per minute, preferably, and then you play around in the verse and the chorus with the rhythm and the meter. And then when you put people in scanners and you build the kind of models that I showed you earlier, when you look at how it is the signals are propagating and where they're propagating to, or who is talking to who as you have these experiences, you can basically show that what happens when you are in the groovy state, which is the middle one here, you have a maximal meter stability. Now, meter stability is a measure of criticality. If you think about sand being in a sand pile, sometimes if the dynamics of a sandpile are right. You put down one sand corn and you get these avalanches. This is when you have the most criticality. And that's exactly what your brain is like when you are feeling groovy. And then you can start to look at what parts of the brains are active when you're feeling groovy. This is the brain when you are feeling pleasure. This is the brain when you're feeling groovy. So I give you what I call the eudaimonia of groove. And you now know what that means. It means human flourishing. It means the kind of things that we could use to interact with those babies. Make them dance, make them sleep. Use music as a way of interacting that allows us to show us really what is the nature of love. But there's much that remains to be done, and I'm hoping to do that with you here. Here's a center that we've done in Denmark. Here's some Danish people being groovy. Here's a book I've written called Emotion, Pleasure and Pain in the Brain. I also wrote a book called The Pleasure Center, a paid book, as you can see. And when you do that, people in Oxford look at you and they say, Morton, are you sure that's science? And so I was pretty sure it was science, I have to say. So I wrote another book called Pleasures of the Brain, which is a sort of like magnum opus that when dropped on the third floor can kill a man or a woman. So if you really want to know about pleasure, not afraid to ask, that's the book to go for. Also to remind us, I wrote a book on consumption, not tuberculosis, but what happens when we buy. And again, I'm not sure there's a lot of pleasure there. There's certainly a lot of obsession there. Here's the group. Wonderful people that I work with. The one thing I should just say is that really this is about empathy. And so in the last 2 minutes, I'd just like to do a plug for empathymuseum.com, which is the brainchild of this man, Roman Kasnarek, who wrote a book called Empathy, Why It Matters and How to Get It, which is basically a museum that is a pop-up museum. We have these containers that we ship around the world, and we'd love to send one here to Joburg or to Cape Town or anywhere you want us to send it to. And in there you find this shoe collection. You get these fine blue shoes, and you get a set of headphones, and you can hear what it's like to be a crazy Oxford professor who's interested in pleasure and flourishing, or a set of high heels and a woman who may be interested in other things, or a Syrian refugee. And then your only thing is you have to walk a mile in those shoes and see how that changes you. And the interesting thing is, from our audience, and lots of people have been through it now, it does change them. And of course, when we think about the parental brain, that is really the one chance we have of really being changed. There are 3 major moments in our lives. When we're little, first 18 months, which is really when the thermostat of how much we're going to enjoy this life or not. And of course, very much linked to our caregivers. Then adolescence, when we like to learn the right kind of music. And then there's when we become parents. Parenthood changes us more than anything else. And what it shows us, I think, is really our capacity for love. And these little critters, with those kind of templates that we have in our brains, that, by the way, is one of the reasons why we breed cats and dogs to look like babies, is because that's what we like. This is really why we get excited about these things. But at the end of the day, it's about empathy, it's about the nature of love. And I'll just finish with one of my favorite poets, Derek Walcott, who says, "For every poet is always morning in the world. History a forgotten insomnia at night. History and elemental awe are always our early beginning, because the fate of poetry is to fall in love with the world in spite of history." Thank you.